That is, how can we understand salvation better? How can we understand God's character through the sanctuary? In the book of Psalms, chapter 77 and verse 13, God says, "Thy way is in the sanctuary." Here God is telling us that His way of salvation, is found within this very device. We will find in this study together that the ministry of Christ is magnified as we understand the sanctuary. Some don't spend any time trying to understand the sanctuary at all, calling it Old Testament. But the reality is, friends, that without the sanctuary, you and I would have a hard time understanding any of the prophetic things that are found in Revelation, since many of them revolve around the very compartments of the sanctuary itself. Revelation, the first couple chapters, we find that Christ stands among the candlesticks, which is a representation of the first compartment of that sanctuary. As we move through Revelation, for example, in chapter 11 and verse 19, we find Christ standing in another compartment of the sanctuary. The scripture reads, "And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in His temple the ark of His testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings, and an earthquake and great hail." Okay, so we need to know more about the sanctuary. We need to understand it better. Well, where did Moses get his understanding from the sanctuary? Where did these blueprints for the sanctuary come from? Actually, he was shown these blueprints, or the actual sanctuary, that existed in heaven. Exodus chapter 25 and verse 40, the Lord said to Moses, "And look that thou make them," being the sanctuary and their items, "after their pattern, which was showed thee in the mount." So Moses had this rare opportunity of seeing the sanctuary as it exists in heaven, the true sanctuary, the one that's not made with hands. And so Moses, when he came down, he had an idea of the pattern that he was to make here on earth. Let's begin to have a look at what this sanctuary is made of. Question number one, what furniture was in the courtyard? Well, as we entered into the courtyard, first thing we would notice is that there's only one way in. There's only one door, only one passage to get into this sanctuary. Once inside the courtyard, the first item we would see is the altar of burnt offering. Find a scripture for that in Exodus 29:18. "And thou shalt burn the whole ram upon the altar. It is a burnt offering unto the Lord." Now the sinner, bringing an animal in with him, would then confess his sin on top of the head of that animal. Then he, being the sinner, would have to cut the neck of that animal and watch the blood run out. This was a very solemn event, and it was really given to help them to understand that their sin had cost the life of this animal. Then the priest would catch some of that blood, and he would continue on through his ministry. The sinner would then have to cut the animal open and separate certain items, the fat from the meat, and pull the entrails out, and some very intricate things that we'll get into at a later time. But at this time, some of that animal was burnt on this altar of burnt offering. The next item is the laver of brass. Exodus 30 and verse 18, "Thou shalt also make a laver of brass, and thou shalt put water therein." Here is where the priest would wash and cleanse himself as he would minister back and forth between the holy place and the courtyard. Here's a picture of that outer courtyard. Again, you have one door coming in. Then you have the altar of burnt offering, then the laver behind that, before you would enter into the actual enclosed part of the sanctuary. Now, the first part of that sanctuary, the enclosed part, was called the holy place. What three items of furniture were in the holy place? Well, we would have the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and also the candlestick. Numbers 4:7, "And upon the table of showbread thou shalt spread a cloth of blue, and the continual bread shall be thereon." Part of the priest's duty was to continually, daily, have new bread placed upon that table of showbread. Also, there was the candlestick, Numbers chapter 8 and verse 2. "When thou lightest the lamps, the 7 lamps shall give light over against the candlestick." Another one of the duties of the priests was to keep oil within this lampstand so that those 7 lights would stay lit. Exodus 30 and verse 1 gives us the third item, "And thou shalt make an altar to burn incense upon, of shittim wood shalt thou make it." And again, this is a very extravagant, gold-covered box that also the incense would be burned upon, and that incense was said to float above the veil that separated this compartment of the sanctuary from the most holy part of the sanctuary. Sometimes it gets confusing. The first part was the holy place. The second part of that enclosed part of the sanctuary was called the most holy place. And so there was a veil that separated those two compartments. This altar of incense was up against that veil, and the incense would float above the veil into the most holy place. And as we get into this more, we'll understand that that represented the prayers of the people of God and how it would enter into the very presence of God in the most holy place. Let's talk about that most holy place now. The most holy place contained something that was of great importance. It contained the Ark of the Covenant. And you would find that as the priest would enter into that compartment only one time a year, and in there was the Ark of the Covenant, Exodus 26:34, and thou shalt put the mercy seat upon the Ark of the Testimony in the most holy place. Hollywood has made a great spectacle of this Ark of the Covenant, and many people have written books and movies have been made about where this Ark is today. Much of the importance seems to be placed on the box itself, the Ark of the Covenant. But the reality is, biblically, the most important thing about the Ark of the Covenant was not the box, but it was what was in the box that mattered. So let's find out what that was. Exodus 25 and verse 21. And thou shalt put the mercy seat above the ark, and in the ark thou shalt put the testimony that I shall give thee. What was that testimony? Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 4 and 5. And he wrote on the tables according to the first writing the 10 Commandments. And I turned myself and came down from the mount and put the tables in the ark which I had made. So here we see very clearly that the rocks in the box were what were important, the 10 Commandments, the moral code of God, the unchangeable law written with his own finger inside of that box is where they rested. Now, Jewish scholars tell us that there was a glory that radiated from this most holy place. They refer to it as the Shekinah glory. And this glory was so bright, so magnificent, so glorious that no man is said to have looked upon it and live. And that is why only one time a year was the high priest ever allowed to enter into this most holy place, and that time and that place was designated by God. Ecclesiastes 12:13 tells us, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." We see as we study the commandments of God that they contain the attributes of God, his very character. So we can understand why that Shekinah glory, that presence of God, would exist in that most holy place alongside of the 10 Commandments. Psalm 19:7 tells us, "The law of the Lord is perfect, and in keeping them there is great reward." Again, as we look at the attributes of God, if we had enough time, we would go through all these verses and see that when it says something about God's character, it says the exact same thing about God's unchangeable law. Just a few examples. God is spiritual. It also says that his law is spiritual. God is love. It also says his law is love. God is truth. It also says that his law is truth. And we could go right down the list and see that every characteristic between God's character and his law is exactly the same. So the 10 Commandments are but a profile of God's character that is unchangeable. And the idea that this 10 Commandments, that the Ark of the Covenant was in the most holy place, gives us the idea that as we come closer to Christ, as we come closer to God, his ideal is to get us back into the very presence of God. In the garden, we learned that sin separated us from that intimate walk that Adam and Eve had with God. The sanctuary shows us that as we come into his presence, the idea is to draw us back in to the most holy place. So here is a picture of what an Israelite camp may have looked like. You see that the sanctuary is in the center of the camp, because the idea is that it is the center of their relationship with God. It is the plan of salvation. Here's a video rendition of entering into the sanctuary. Here we see the outer courtyard with the burnt offering, and we're entering into the sanctuary. Here we have the candlestick and the showbread and the altar of incense.